Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're hailing from. Welcome to this very special live stream. I am Chris Short, host with the most of this live stream. You might know me from my newsletter DevOpsish and my website chrisshort.net. I also work at AWS as a senior developer advocate, and I'm joined today by the one and only Wesley Faulkner. Wesley, how are you?
I am doing well, and I too also work at AWS. I am the senior community manager for North America for developer relations in AWS.
That's awesome. Thank you for joining me today. Today we're talking about like DevRel and kind of
Yes.
developer, like just talking to developers, right? Like in the sense
Yes.
of like outreach and developer relations, right? Like what ultra successful people do who practice DevRel is kind of a big deal to people. And this all started from a tweet that a tweet thread that you
Yeah.
shared with the world weeks and weeks ago now. I just posted that in chat, folks, so you can see it there. The the thread was picked up by Jeff Barr. Like he even like mentioned it. So I kind of wanted to bring you on and kind of break down the thread a little bit more in long form, so we can get not just a good Twitter thread, but also a good conversation out of the deal too, right?
Yeah. I kind of like it kind of exploded. I
It's
was very surprised about like how much
right.
traction it got. But also, it's also a tweet thread, which is very confined, not very like
Yes.
nuanced, and there's a lot of detail left out. So I'm glad to have this opportunity to kind of clear up some of the things that came afterwards about my tweet thread. So thank you for having me
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, no problem. And I think it's important to note that like it did blow up in a way that a lot of people, chimed in and probably had missed some context because of the way they
Yeah.
saw it and Twitter doing what it's doing and everything. So, yeah, having a fully thought out kind of conversation was the goal here.
Yes.
So, you started off the whole thread with, there's a saying that developers are notoriously hard to market to and gain their trust, which are kind of the same thing, I feel like. Same
Yeah.
thing with CTOs, CIOs, and IT decision makers. And a lot of times, the developers you and I talk to day are a huge part of that feedback loop for a company.
Hmm.
So, kind of, you broke out there's two groups that comprise the bulk of the target audience for most DevRel programs. Like, what are those two groups in your mind?
So the two groups, if you think of the way that a company that uses technology is structured, the approach from an outside in is either through the top or through the bottom, going from the top down or bottom up in an organization. So if you think about the bottom up, those are the developers who actually work for the company, who are producing the code or maintaining systems or creating new concepts or modules, whatever, to make sure that the company works. And then when you think of the top down, it's the IT decision makers, the CIOs, the CTOs, or the people who might have the ear and the pull to make decisions
Mm-hmm.
happen from a structural software architectural standpoint, or what to buy. And their voices have really big sway into making sure that those decisions of purchases go through, or at least
Mm-hmm.
are initiated, because it's hard to have that stuff go through without their say so, or tacit approvals specifically.
Yeah, and a lot of times they have their own opinions and assumptions, right, about what's
Yeah.
going to work best for them. And, there's some, use cases where, like, you know, company X isn't even on their radar, but, you would think
Yeah.
it would be, but
Hmm.
they've already ruled it out based off some previous experience or whatever. So it does make these two groups hard to reach. Why do you think they are so hard to reach, right? Do they insulate themselves somehow, right? Like, is there just that nerd culture of like privacy, right? Like, we have an ultra high focus on that, I feel like sometimes.
I think so. Generally speaking, in terms of tech, it
Mm-hmm.
is fast moving. No matter
Yeah.
where you are, generally speaking, unless you're working on COBOL and the IRS or something like that, then things are fairly steady state. But Otherwise, things move so much. So the centers of knowledge and where people come together to get information, that also is able to be fractured by a new player rather than the incumbent being the default.
Mhm.
So if television was the mainstay of the masses, that run was very long.
Mhm.
Think about printed magazines and then moving into digital magazines. All of this was an evolution of how the masses consumed information.
Yeah.
With tech, it's been that, but then the audience seems fairly niche of the type of problems, the type of people, and the type of questions and philosophies and theories that go around. You kind of have to find the best place for your specific topic in order to feel like you can grow or evolve as a person, because you have to stay current, or you could be left behind. So the next comeuppance could happen at any time. So
Yeah.
you could stay on a blog and read a blog, but then there might be this new blog or this new TikTok or this new YouTube channel or
Mhm.
this new live stream that happens where people are like, I just need to keep staying on top of the new thing, what people are talking about, where those topics are being discussed and debated. And you kind of have to move in a mass of people and at the same time do um, do the things that keep you grounded. So the in terms of basic tech stacks, but at the
Mhm.
same time, you also need to expand to see if there are new solutions to new problems that you might be running into. So all this like non-fixed point of what is true, what is like the single source of truth, all of that is just so fluctuating. So it's kind of like where if you want to talk to these people, where do you find them? Um, and a lot of times you have to curate your own audience in order to attract the developers or those people who are interested in that. And so, but it's kind of the same cycle. You yourself as a content creator need to stay on top of this in order to make sure that you're satiating the growing demands and needs of people who are looking for this information.
Mhm.
So it's creating and finding is all of that's mixed up, and so that's why it's really hard to pinpoint and find these people, because there is no single source, there is no one developer, even there is
Right.
no one thing that people are always interested in. It's changing all the time.
Constantly. So we have kind of a high level question here. I think it's worth answering.
Mhm.
Does DevRel or is DevRel a subset of product management, or is it the same but with developer community focus? Hmm.
That's a good
S-
question.
y-
I
I would
would
say
say
yes.
one thing about DevRel is it's almost like a dictionary term, like the word community. I'm a community manager. Community can mean different things to different people. DevRel can be implemented differently for different companies.
Hmm.
There is the idealized version of DevRel in which it is the glue that kind of connects everything internally in terms of departments and externally in terms of the needs of the users and the needs of the community and the developer ecosystem as a whole. So all of that webbing is considered DevRel in some aspects,
Hmm.
and some people might sever some of those ties. Some people might make some of those junctions a little bit stronger than others. So yes, and kind of like the improv answer, but also the engineering answer. It depends. So depending on
Yeah.
how your group is organized and how priorities are set at any given time.
Yeah. I'm very fortunate to be working on kind of like a brand new project. So like providing feedback into the product, like it's not even
Hmm.
out yet. So like I have to take on that perspective of someone picking up this project for the first
Right?
time, and maybe it's their first time ever doing the thing the project was designed to do. So I have
Yeah.
to think from that perspective. So like I got to go way like mentally back in my history and time and be like, okay,
Hmm.
when I first started working with VMs, things were confusing because of X. When I first
Yes.
started working with containers, things were confusing because of Y. And like focus on those things first.
Hmm.
And like
Yeah. The
you
burden of
kind of
knowledge is what you have right now. You gotta.
right. Like I
Yeah.
have so much knowledge in my head about
Yeah.
distributed systems. I sometimes have to spend a lot of time just saying, "Oh, wait, a lot of this is just focusing on the basics and
Hmm.
like getting back to those and focusing on them." But you mentioned, how to influence these groups, and right, it's very hard, right? Like I write a newsletter to keep up with the tech stuff that's happening, like you just talked about. But it's also to just maintain some kind of presence out there of just, general trust, right? Like you can trust what this guy's saying. How do you influence groups like that, right? Like these decision makers in IT, I guess, is what we're talking. And they vary from developer all the way up to CEO.
Yes, that is a complicated question. Some people value some things over others. They're because of this moving target that I described before, of where the masses are going or the conversation is moving. Sometimes there are bellwethers where there are people who are on the pulse of those things, and so
Hmm.
you can either follow them or listen to them as they report back about the status of different communities or different tools or even different technologies as they're released. So you might hear about Rust and like, oh, there's person starting to talk about Rust, and this other person is also starting to talk about Rust. That's two signals from people I trust that can help move the conversation into understanding those type of technologies. But there's also um, critical understanding, right?
Hmm.
So being able to not just move to the shiny, but understand what the advantages are, but also the detractors, so that you get a good, accurate description of what this can and cannot do. And so the people who are considered um, knowledgeable, but as well as reliable, are those who are able to balance listening, hearing, evaluating, and really looking at things from a critical perspective, so that you can dissect it and just compare it. So, going back to the question about or the answer that it depends, means that it's
Hmm.
not, whatever this technology is, it's not for everyone. So being able to really say, here's who's this technology is good for, and allowing to take the burden off a lot of that thinking about, like, okay, I got to read all this documentation, I have to spin up a project in order to actually
Hmm.
try to evaluate to see if what this does. Having people who you trust to do that for you allows you to actually accelerate your learning, because you are able to weed out the things that don't apply to you or what you're doing, and actually keep on your own internal, like, compass if this is moving in the right
Yes.
direction of where you need to be.
Yeah, like what I like to remind people is like, are you a software company? Are you a SaaS company? Are you
Mhm.
are you a widget company or a service company of some other sort, right? Like
Yeah.
if your job is to help make travelers happy, right? And those travelers are unhappy, technology can help you with that. We've seen
Hmm.
that happen with like Twitter and, airlines and everything. Um, but if you are somehow like too in the weeds, I guess, of how the machinery works, you can lose focus of what really matters to your customer base. So that's a very
Yes.
good point that you bring up, right?
Yeah.
And
You could talk
yeah,
about compression ratios in an engine, or you can
yeah,
talk about 0 to 60, depending on the level of information. Going too deep can make cause you to, like, be blinded by some of the stuff that what people actually are looking for.
yes. And SKN responded that developers are typically rigid people. I wish that wasn't the case sometimes, but I feel like that's actually changing. So having DevRel or developer advocacy with the product teams does make a lot of sense. And I should point out, I'm the only developer advocate on my team, and I interface with your team, Wesley, kind of here and there
Mhm.
kind of deal. So it's the way we do it here at AWS is very unique compared to some organizations because
Yeah.
I know I get the job offers all the time that are like, "Hey, join us as our director of developer advocacy. You'd report to the CMO," and it's like, developer
Yeah.
advocacy isn't really a marketing thing, right? Like
Right.
those metrics just don't align. All right,
Right.
like
And then
can
also that same company could be, you could be the second employee. So you
yeah,
report to this,
that's also not so fun too
reporting
sometimes.
to the CEO, aka me, the person sending you this email.
Yeah, 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 and I really appreciate you reaching out. However, I'm very happy with where I am. Thank you. So yeah, there is a distinction between like if you're on the product side or the marketing side, I feel like sometimes. And
Yes.
you could lose some of your voice if you're just coming at people with like personas and marketing and all that kind of thing, right? Like I was a product marketer for a year on the Ansible team and then switched back over to technical product marketing um, so that I could be more in the weeds because like my blog posts for like Ansible releases were like technical as hell compared to what they used
Hmm.
to be. And it was like, okay,
Yes.
clearly I'm not in the right spot. I'm a little over rotated on in the community and working with the tool, right? So now that I'm at AWS, it's like, all right, I was on the EKS team, I'm on this new project team, and now I can have this great focus. Thanks to the project being of few components compared to something like EKS, where it's like, wow, where does the story ever end with Kubernetes, right? Like,
Hmm.
there's always something else that's getting tacked on or you can do with it. So it's a lot of times, like, even for the people doing the developer advocacy, sometimes the customer is going to come to you and ask you questions that are like, yes, that's related to the thing I do, but I don't know anything about it
Right.
yet. You know?
Yeah, and just a point of clarity, every department doesn't mean that one's better than the other.
Hmm.
It's just that your objectives or the thing you're focusing on and the thing you're measuring
Right.
changes with different departments. And so you're always going to push forward the thing that you measure. And so if you are in a group that measures engagement, feedback from the community, for instance, it's different than sales or even marketing. So where you live in an org can kind of force you in a direction where you're pushing on the objectives that is kind of like coming from on high. And you
Hmm.
just have to make sure that you're moving the needle in the direction that they want you to.
Yeah. And it's all about understanding what your expectations are, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's a two-way street, right? Like when we are reaching out to customers and talking to them, if their expectations are, yeah, AWS is going to deliver us the moon. Well, we're not into building planets, so sorry, we're not going to build
Or
you a moon
satellites.
either. Or
Yeah.
satellites. Well, I mean, we do satellites here at AWS, but um, yeah, that's a growing aspect of it.
Right.
Um, So yeah, that whole side of the business fascinates me anyway. So I wouldn't be surprised if I'm over there at some point in time, depending upon how long I'm at AWS. So yeah,
Right. Right.
it's like there's so many fun things here. It's like a kid in a candy store. I feel like
Yeah, and
sometimes.
also that's also the part of DevRel when since you are attached to different companies, different aspects, and you're kind of like able to sample a lot from the buffet in terms of what a company does because you kind of need to just be aware at least of everything that's going on for the company
Hmm.
that you're trying to represent anyway,
Yeah,
which is great.
yeah. So how do you help folks understand thing, like whatever that thing is that you're talking about at that moment? Do you have any like tricks of the trade that you could share with folks, maybe?
Well, there's a so going back to the thread um, in terms of explaining DevRel to someone else and moving into the point where you're trying to explain the product as a representative of the company in DevRel, doing DevRel. That sometimes looking at the one hop explanation of
Mm-hmm.
really what services or products that are really great that developers should know about. The simple approach is the one hop. Hey, we sell this, you should buy this. Some
Yeah,
people think
right.
that that's
Exactly.
what
Yeah.
it is. But
No.
the best approach is to do the multiple hops, just
Hmm.
understanding like, hey, let's have a conversation. This is the way that I like to speak. How do you like to be spoken to? What are your needs?
Yeah.
What are the ways that you're looking to fulfill those needs? What are your own resources? How is the best way to integrate what you're already doing to this new product and service that may make the people that you're doing or you're integrating with more productive, spend less time, spend less headache? What can I take off your plate? So those are longer engagements and conversations, especially for new products where there's a giant education piece. When
Hmm.
you invent something brand new and people don't even know that they need something or even think or look or even looking for that, those are also really hard conversations because you have to front load what is the description of the product. Like, for instance,
Right.
I think in the grand scheme of things, observability is relatively new.
Hmm.
It's just like DevRel, but telling people why observability is important may take some education. So you don't
Yeah.
go and just say, buy my observability product. You have to just understand how things are knit together, why
Hmm.
you might run into a scenario and show like, okay, here's the before, here's the after, and this is how I can transition you from there to there.
Right.
Those types of conversations of being able to paint a scene, and how I like to do it. And I think I've done it several times as well, where if you can get them to see it in their brain, envision it, then
Hmm.
you're halfway there into understanding how to move that construct into the direction where this new steady state where things are solved or fixed or easier
Hmm.
is obtainable.
And kind of to continue down this road here, right? Like sometimes you ask for like, what does your end state look like? And
Hmm.
oftentimes you can give them something better, right? Like
Yes.
that happens and kind of
Yes.
routinely, it feels like here, especially because it's like they think about, this one myopic view and you say, well, wait a minute. What about
Yeah.
these other
Yes.
stakeholders that you talk to all the time?
Was it Henry Ford who said if I asked people what they wanted, they would have wanted a faster horse because
Yeah,
they couldn't have
exactly.
envisioned the automobile kind of a thing? Like,
Yeah.
yes, sometimes if you know more, uh, going back to the burden of knowledge, if you
Mm,
know more information about what you can do, it's hard for them to describe it. So it's better actually for them to describe what are their problems and what a solution will unburden them from doing,
yeah.
or just not being like locked into their own grammar system. Like if you
Hmm.
don't have words for things, you can't use those words. And
Mm,
so having to describe a new state or a new end state with only your limited knowledge or vocabulary or grammar or whatever can be really difficult. So it's hard to have people explain, what does the perfect world look like?
yeah. And I spent time working in DevOps and working as a DevOps consultant. And a lot of times I would just ask people, like, what do you do? What's something you do all the time?
Hmm.
That you have to like schedule and do and have a reminder for, da 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 da. And they're like, oh, well, I have to do this one thing and this other thing and this thing I have to check every week. And it's like, well, what if I could tell you could do all that with one command, right? Like,
Yeah.
oftentimes, like that's kind of the thing that I focus on. It's like, let's get rid of the monotony, if anything, right? And
Yes.
get
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
freed up so you can focus on the bigger problems, right? And sometimes if they don't know what like they have a lot of problems and they don't know where to start, sometimes that's the best place is just giving people more time so they can
Yes.
think more about other things.
And who would have thought that if, there's that education piece,
Right.
unless you can tell them that this system exists that
Hmm.
can like map onto your existing process so that this burden can be released. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's a big deal. Yeah, and like these folks have hard problems to solve usually, right? Like, and we both need context, right? Like they need context on how their systems work. But what we often find is that we need a lot of context too, because they have their own, acronyms or,
Yep.
processes or anything, you name it, right? Like there's all kinds of stuff. What are some tips you have for getting at the why something exists, right? Because they'll say we have a problem with this system sometimes, or we have a problem doing this thing. And it's like, well, why does that exist?
Hmm.
And it's like, why are you using that thing to do that? If you have a problem with it, why? And there's sometimes like you get in this situation where it's like, oh, we have to tie into this thing because yes, it's regulatory, but there's other times it's because this other product team forced us to pick this tool, right? And it's like that kind of stinks for folks, and I feel the pain there often.
Yeah. I, because of the changes that happen, a lot of the
Hmm.
movement in terms of a system is incremental.
Yeah.
And so you have a starting point and then you build out in one direction for a feature. You build out another direction for scalability. You build out in another direction to save on costs. And so you're kind of moved or pulled into these directions. Sometimes they're of your own choice, but sometimes they're not. Especially if you're talking about, prior management, legacy code, code debt, that kind of stuff. Sometimes things are the way they are because you don't know how it works, and you cannot touch something to break it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people are considering fighting fires or taming something that is blowing up, understanding the new state where you transition and moving some of that headcount or even engineering time to do this new thing seems impossible when you're already dealing with limited resources, even though that it could change how you fundamentally do things and really get rid of some of the things that are holding you back. And so when people are in that place where they are scared of change, sometimes it's rightly so, based on their own environment. So when people are stuck of why they do things, and it's because this is how it used to be, sometimes that not worrying about the thing that is the current state is a way to people like stay healthy and sane. Cause they're like, I don't even know if I just don't want to even deal with that. And because if their job is to keep things up, they may not be examining of how to squeak out efficiencies. If they're concerned about accuracy, if you're in a like fintech or something, and you're like, this gives us the answers we need, and if we move to another system, we have to do all this other validation in order to make sure that we're getting the results that we need. All of that stuff is why people may not want to open up a black box to try to tinker with the gears a bit. And so, like I said, sometimes it's really great, but there's ways to do that as well, where it may be, depending on what your constraints are, time, resources, and of course, money, where you can do this in parallel, and you can do several testing systems and stuff like that to make sure that you don't actually need to take apart the things, but you just need to understand your endpoint and your diagrams and making sure that everything looks the same from the input to the output. So what we're talking about is sometimes a lack of imagination, right? Some people cannot even think about why things can be different because they don't understand what is new. They're not tied into these systems. They're not tied into these groups. They're not tied into these communities. We're not being fed different ways to imagine a different world, imagine a new way of doing things. And so in order to really get to those groups as well, when we're talking about where they are, if they are at the bottom, then you need to come in through the CIO top part of the funnel. If they're at the top, you have to reverse it so that the information is coming to them depending on who they have to work with and integrate with, where they can see a better way. And then we're talking about influencing through third parties, right? You reach out to a person who knows something, who is able to reach out to the person who actually can make or enact that change.
Yeah. And having relationships, I think, is the most important part of what we do, right? Like establishing relationships is very important. But you went even deeper, right? Like I say establishing relationships, you say like to maintain a productive state, you have to have higher order thinking. And that's where this conversation starts to turn very interesting. So tell us more about that. I got some links to share if need be, folks. So don't worry.
This is the out there part of the thread where I kind of deviate from.
I don't think it's that out there, to be honest with you, but okay.
Well, I think empathy, right? We've heard like be empathetic and when you approach people, but I just wanted to. You can't empathize unless you can put yourself in someone else's shoes. And for those who can't empathize, there's compassion. And compassion allows you to really, once you try to understand where someone is coming from and what their needs are, to kind of like meet them where they are. So if a baby is crying, you may not remember what it's like to be a baby, but you can still approach that infant with
Right.
compassion. Where higher order thinking is thinking that is the pyramid of the base layer being worrying about safety, worrying about food, shelter, that kind of stuff, and then worried about like the middle layers, like acceptance, like being welcomed into a community, being able to feel like you're belonging to a group or organization, or that you are in touch with yourself. And then the higher order thinking is where I kind of establish, like, if you're a developer, you're kind of well paid. So some of that bottom layer is taken care of. So you don't think about that so much. You
Hmm.
kind of think of you're living in the higher order part of thinking, where you're
Right.
dissecting problems. You're trying to understand yourself better. You're
Hmm.
looking for more enlightenment of kind of like moving to another plane of thought. And you kind of have to live there when you are dealing with problems that either have never been like fixed or addressed before, especially if you're talking about a startup, even some established companies
Hmm.
where they're really trying to do a paradigm shift. They're trying to innovate in a place where there is an opportunity, which means that you are solving new problems. In order to solve new problems, you don't have to worry. You shouldn't have to worry about whether or not you have electricity. You don't have to
Right.
worry about if you are going to be shot. That
Hmm.
type of mental bandwidth kind of pulls away from the higher order thought process, where your capacity is diminished. And so you have to be able to live and stay in that spot where you can mull over problems, you can mull over approaches, you can think about creating the next database that has never been invented before, or the
Right.
next way of doing high volume input, and processing that data, or reaching people on a new device, like a
Right.
smart speaker, for
Yeah.
instance.
Yeah.
That's kind of like green space, where anything goes, but you have to not only understand the approach, understand the second, third, and even fourth order consequences of implementing these new ways of like interactions or thinking, or dealing with data or people. So that takes a lot of brain power, which means if you are going to be effective, you need to stay there longer, so you can mull over these problems longer, so you can come up with these solutions quicker. And so you can think about the second order consequences, um, in conjunction with your implementation, with your deployment, and the way that things are received by other people, and to pivot around that. If if you're not taking these constraints um, in order to do these deployments, you are going to have to do a lot of refactoring later on, and that's something you want to like not waste
Yeah.
your time on. So thus, that's why I said, if you are like a person at the peak of your optimization as a developer, you're probably in that higher order thinking, so that you can be considered someone who's extremely productive and effective in your role.
Yeah. Like the the idea of, like, a lot of people fear losing their jobs, which is totally
Yeah.
like a normal fear. But some people, I've noticed, have a fear of, if I make a mistake, I'll lose my job. And
Yes.
like that is not a tenable environment, right? Like if you're
Yes.
in that kind of situation for real, like if you
Hmm.
feel that way, talk to your manager. But if you are in that situation for real, you've got the that's the problem you have to actually fix sometimes. And that has nothing to do with tech, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's sometimes that's just, I need you to trust me and I need us to all work on the same page. And it's really interesting when you pull people together to just say, like, not actually say psychological safety, but talk about it in a way that this allows us to go further, kind of thing.
Yeah, and psychological safety is really, really important.
Yes.
I touched on how DAE and I and all of that stuff is integrated, because if you have to compartmentalize part of yourself away from your job and the way of being, that also takes a lot of mental
Yeah.
gymnastics to say, oh, when I went out to dinner with my partner, and people might think, oh, I don't want them to know that I'm gay. So I have to say, okay, I have to say partner, not my husband or something like that, because I'll be stigmatized, because I'll be judged. And then maybe I'll get a bad review, and then maybe they'll force me out of the company. Or if you approach a problem differently because you're neurodiverse, and for instance, and so if they haven't thought about it and they haven't understand how that really will avoid future problems and not current issues, they may think you're dumb or stupid, or
Right.
then not working with the team, not a team player, all those different things. So there's different ways of psychological safety where if you're not like playing like the political game where you're not making your boss look good, but instead
Just doing good things.
you're just focused on doing the job and doing the work, where they want you to produce quickly. And so like the patch might go in quickly, but you know that you're just kicking the can down the road in terms of solving something that's critical. And you just want to, and you're doing on a not on my watch kind of way of operating, where like it's going to break. I just hope it's not me who is in charge or on call when it does, type of thought process, where you reward being the person that saves a day when things do blow up, rather than the person preventing the problems. Like these are different ways of where you have to like feel like you have to adjust to the work environment, rather than doing what's best for either the customer or the company. But it's not, you're doing all the side stuff on the in order to just survive. That's all going to compromise your effectiveness.
Right. Like it 100% compromises your effectiveness. And I kind of had to have, we have a situation where we don't have childcare for a few hours tomorrow. And it's like, ooh. So remember, this puts me in a situation where I have to kind of balance the two things, and neither one really works, right? Like I end up having to focus on kid as opposed to half job and half kid. So like I just had a reminder of that. And she's like, I know, it's just because of this situation we're in right now. It won't be like this all the time. She's just starting volleyball season, so it's like her first full week of practice. And I'm like, remember, you know, these are important things. I can't have kids stomping around above me upstairs and not wonder what's going on, you know? Or we fill the house with cameras. Take your pick. There is technology.
Right. Yeah. Little column A, little column B. Yeah. You can, being able to worry about that stuff and being able to be transparent about that is very important when you talk about psychological safety, to have that relationship with the powers that be, your manager, your CEO, whatever. There's this saying, if you can speak it, you can survive it. So, being forced to deal with your own situation without it being a team mentality and being more individualistic can make being at work a lot harder than it needs to be as well.
Yeah, I can't even, you know, like, yes, I have disabilities and such, and those come into play often at work because like, oh, I have to have surgery at the end of the month. Like that's a big deal, right? Like, but it's one of those things where it's like, if I don't have the time to do that, I can't function at all.
Right.
So if
or
I'm
worse,
like,
you put it off so much and
I'm just
and
like,
hiding it, and no
suffering.
one knows.
Right. Like I'm not going to be like the most effective person I could be. I'm not going to be part of a team that can be the most effective team it could be. I'm at worst, I'll be holding the team back because I'm not there, or there's missing context sometimes, or whatever. So yeah, having to deal with just being yourself at work is a lot for some people. And that, I think, is underappreciated sometimes in larger organizations, right? Sometimes that gets lost in kind of the process and, you know, movement of people and things, right? So,
and aren't we all kind of a little weird where we are willing to help other people when they need help, but at the same time, we're not willing to say we need help? And so everyone is just sitting there willing to help everyone, but no one's saying that they need help at the same time. And so it's just like a vicious cycle where everyone is just like, well, if someone says they need help, I'll step up, but I won't be that person.
Right, exactly. And, you know, it was funny when I was transitioning teams here at AWS, I was like, hey, listen, like a release slipped. So like I'm working on this blog post. I don't want to be working on it maybe 3 months from now when I'm on this new team. And he was like, good point. yeah, hand that off to this person. And I was like, okay, cool. But it was like, just reminding, these are the things that I have in flight and are kind of, not going to be my ball anymore. Where
Yeah.
do they need to go? And like sometimes people are doing stuff because they've always done it and they don't realize that someone else is there at the company that should be doing it maybe, or there's a new process so that they don't have to do that, but they needed something else from that process that they don't have. They weren't able to provide any feedback into it either.
Right. And this enlightenment part of the pyramid at the top
Mm-hmm.
for the higher order thinking, some people don't think like ascension or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's that where you just understand the human condition and how we are all kind of like meshed together. And so that you can just understand of like self-actuation and self-esteem even. And when you have that security where you can just kind of branch out the way of thinking to the point where you can allow yourself to be vulnerable, you can allow yourself to be transparent, where you can then translate that into your work, where if you're able to be transparent, if you're able to say, hey, I just don't think I know this, then you can
Yeah.
ask for help and someone can say, well, let's just team up and let's just shadow me for a bit. And then you're able to get that jump start so that instead of like mulling it over and trying to teach yourself
Mm-hmm.
for 3 weeks, you can have a 2 hour session where you can then be productive so much quicker.
Right.
And so being able to like understand those two dynamics and how you yourself can, from a way that you see yourself, can, that's the higher order thinking that I'm talking
Mm-hmm.
about.
Yeah. And if you can see yourself being successful, that's the most important thing. If you have a clear
Hmm.
road to success, is even better, right? Like we
Exactly.
we do that pretty good here at AWS versus other companies I've worked at, right? Where it's been, oh, promotion. Let's talk about that next time.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
like,
exactly.
like I already know what I need to do here to be successful because we have such a document-rich culture. I found the doc, so
Hmm.
it opens you up to think about, well, what if there's other people in my shoes a year from now? Let me write that
Hmm.
doc and it'll
Yeah.
be there. So like it eliminates that confusion. And I can't tell you how many times I've just written down how I've done something in a certain open source community and just committed that as, some piece of documentation. And they'd be like, oh, I was always doing it this way. Let me try. Oh yeah, that saves me a ton of time. Uh, and it's just
Yeah.
because they didn't know they could do something that way a
And
lot of
that's that
times.
higher order thinking I was talking about is just basically thinking about the linear progression where you, instead of driving with fog lights where you can only see a little bit ahead and you're just dealing
Hmm.
with things as they come along, you're able to use high beams to really see so much further because you're able to allow yourself to imagine promotion with a
Right.
new job. You're able to think about all the next version 3 years from
Yes.
now because you
Yes.
are secure about all the things that are just generally right around you.
Yeah. And being able to talk openly about that is the most important thing, I feel
Yeah,
like. And if you don't feel like you're in a good spot, make sure that you're thinking about how to put yourself in that good spot. Because I know many times in my own career, I've like taken my eye off of some goal that I had at one point and then ended
absolutely.
up remembering, oh yeah, I wanted to work there. I should apply for a job there. I'm gonna go get
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know.
Uh-huh. Absolutely.
So
Yes.
if you're documenting things for the sake of documentation as opposed to for the sake of somebody using the product, there is a slight nuanced difference there, right? Like if you're so focused on getting job done and not thinking enough about who's using the thing that you're working on, like sometimes
Mhm.
you will release things that aren't
That's that one
fully
hop, right?
baked. Exactly.
Mr.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mr. One Hop. Yeah,
Yeah, like if you don't get enough feedback or if you don't get enough input, you will end up missing more often than not, if that makes sense.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Developers are people.
yeah,
And just,
right.
I'm
Like
sorry,
everybody's human.
breaking news. Do you have one of those banners? Um, yeah. Yeah. And so that's why all this stuff relates to developers, but just being niche and just being able to make sure that you adapt to their working style, to their needs, and being able to come from that perspective is why it's really important.
Yeah. And, and you mentioned, right, like this is all why you can do what you do, right?
Mhm.
And I think in any kind of developer interaction, right, there is like you need to know like certain things that you can say and do versus certain things that are emerging and like balance that. So like I have been in situations where it's like we can fix that, just give us a few months, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's like, yeah, you don't want to say to someone,
yeah,
"Oh,
like
you're
this is
selling
the
a book,
future
just get on
thing.
Oprah or whatever."
Yeah.
There's aren't the solutions themselves are very nuanced and
Hmm.
also take time. You can't have 9 women have a baby in a month.
Right.
You sometimes there are limitations that you have to deal with, and being realistic, both either on the producer or the consumer side, is where you can be transparent. Like you said, when you set expectations, you allow people to make informed choices, and you don't want to trick them into
Right.
doing something that will be advantageous to you and not to them. You
Right.
want to make sure that people can um, do the things that they know in their head are concerns of theirs that you may not be privy to. So it's always best to try to really inform them of everything that
Yeah.
would possibly be in their decision matrix.
Here's the good. Here's the maybe you don't want that, you know?
Right. And
And
tying it back to Amazon, that's why we have multiple stars and comments
yeah, yeah.
and on the consumer side, because people will like to know all the things. It doesn't need to be all 5 stars. That's the only thing I get. But the 4 stars, 3 stars is where you get the nuance, the little bit of information nuggets that may pertain to, okay, the shirts run big. I'm a big person, so that's not a problem for me. So
Right.
it depends is always the reason, and that's why you try to give all of the context when you're trying to explain
Yeah,
something.
and yeah, that's a good point because I've run into different companies have different interpretations of the same regulatory requirements, right?
Mm,
Like their processes are different to meet the same goal. And you have to
yeah,
adjust to that too sometimes, right? Where it's, oh yeah, you're a bank, so you have to do this, 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 and this versus, you know, an online bank which has different rules because they don't have physical offices or whatever, right? So yeah,
right,
it's
yeah,
a whole thing, right? Where it's like sometimes you have to toss aside some things and pick up other things because of the environment they're working on. Them being, you know, whoever you're working with on the relationship side. Um, this is interesting. An interesting question. How would you handle lobbyism in organizations, especially when it comes to rating and grading? SK, I'm assuming you mean like rating and grading solutions you're POCing potentially, right?
or is this because an external actor that has very outsized influence on an organization is able to
Ooh,
push through
yeah.
solutions that are generalized and that everyone in the organization should just adopt because that's where the industry is going, quote unquote?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Possibly. I'm
Right.
not sure which
Yeah.
one of those are. Because when I talked about basically influencers or influences or communities or all that where people move, um, lobbyism is definitely one that could be one of those things where they're
Mm-hmm.
saying where the community is going and they're trying to move the direction of that. There's a clarification: rating
Ah,
employees and promotions, etc.
okay. That is quite the clarification.
Mm. So I'm guessing that's from top down
Mm-hmm.
lobbyism, where like person X, Y, or Z is doing the thing that we like, and so that's the thing that we're going to reward. That is something different. That is culture, right? Um, so where company culture allows basically they reward the things that they want, which goes into what I was saying about departments in terms of where things are being measured and how.
Mm-hmm.
But there is nepotism. There is also people who are discriminated against because they don't meet some things that are the mold of what the company values. That's, I think, one of the reasons why. Um, I guess this is moving into trauma and grief in terms of the pyramid, where like if you feel
Yeah.
like you're not belonging, that's
Mm.
kind of that part of it. because of something, and it causes you to stress. It makes higher order thinking harder. And so if there is internal lobbying for different people or being graded, then that's probably like not the best environment which you can be the most productive. And so those organizations kind of tend to not necessarily be the most innovative because they reward items or things that are not necessarily conducive to good production or quality.
Yeah, and then there's even another question, another follow-up. I have seen people leave power groups when they don't show respect or culture toward toxicity. Wow, that's crazy. How would you handle it? I wouldn't,
Yeah.
to be honest with you.
Leave.
Yeah,
That's where you form your other
yeah,
groups. That's why there's so many groups that keep dying and being resurrected. Like groups that are really good also can be corrupted depending on who's leading it or what they allow
yeah.
in terms of tolerance. And yeah, it's all built into that pyramid. Into diversity and inclusion is basically what you're touching on right there.
Yeah, even Phoebe from the audience agrees. Leaving a toxic culture is a good idea. Yeah,
Yeah.
I had to leave one. I've actually had to leave a couple in my career, and I think there's like two of them I don't even put on my resume because I was there for such a short period of time. Like it was
Yeah.
so toxic, and I found out so quickly upon joining.
Yeah.
It's
That's why a
sad,
governance
but it's true.
structure
Yeah.
is needed to help satiate those.
Hmm.
A way of complaining where you have feedback, where you have adjustments, whereas an organization, if it doesn't have a structure to deal with making adjustments based on the feedback of how people are experiencing that culture, that's why those groups that are extremely top down, saying you only do what we tell you to do,
Hmm.
are probably the ones that can go toxic the quickest.
Oh yeah, yeah. Do this because I told you to is
Hmm.
awful.
Yeah.
I've been there and done that. Um, But you can't leave if you have stakes or you own the company. Well, if you have
That's the
stakes,
lower order thinking, right? The base
yeah.
layer. Am I safe? Do I have like that's all that stuff. Like
Hmm.
I mean, do what you got to do to survive, right? Of course, you have to take care of that. But as you evolve, hopefully, you can move to another situation where that
Yeah.
those order concerns is not something you have to worry about.
I mean, what are some red flags for folks that are like actually interviewing right now? Because I know a lot of people are changing jobs right now, and a lot of
Mhm.
people are. I just saw yesterday a friend of mine went someplace and then came back to the place he left. That's happening like
Yeah.
in droves right now. So,
Some of those is I mentioned between the delta between expectations and reality. And so a good place would be the one that has the smallest delta between the two, which means they do a lot of work for transparency to let you know what the work
mhm,
environment's going to be like, what the work is like, how you're going to be graded on that work, how they've dealt with issues in the past, how they continue to make sure that they have a system in place to make sure that um, things are like communicated effectively.
mhm,
All of those are good green flags, I guess. The
yeah,
red flags are, very top down, get with the program kind of organizations. Those that don't tout like psychological safety or DE&I, those that where they prioritize a lot of um, external pushes rather than employee health or productivity or employee satisfaction, that kind of stuff.
mhm,
Um, there's another red flag that I've seen is those who are. I mentioned about how community is a kind of dictionary word where other people have like an understanding.
mhm,
When they don't go through the work of doing their own self reflection and understanding of what they are looking for, that has been really, especially related to DevRel. They're like, DevRel sounds amazing. Let's do it. And
yeah,
it's not the golden goose. It's not the um, cure all that
mhm,
some people think it is, causes some of those red flags. And so if you're reading a job description or talking to the person who's the hiring manager and they're not able to give a really good description of what the job that they're hiring for actually does, what it looks like, what the day to day looks like, how quickly the the results would come in, what they will look like, even balancing between strategy and execution. is important, because if you're a solopreneur or solo DevRel person or advocate and they want results, then you might have to be forced to do actions immediately, which may not map up to a strategy. So it might seem disjointed, and then you're let go. Or you're brought in to be a person solo in DevRel, and it is mostly strategy, which means that things seem very cerebral, which means things aren't being executed, which means their results aren't coming in, and then you're let go. And so being able to understand all those expectations about what the job actually looks like and how it will affect the bottom line or how you'll be graded, those things are what I'd be looking for a role in DevRel.
Awesome. We have like 5 minutes. I'm going to ask this question. You can reject it, though, based on time. How about
Sure.
that? How do you create compassion and empathy within yourself for customers? Right. I know I have a process,
Mhm.
but like getting that
Like,
understanding and then actually like creating that human connection of, I get it.
I try to be amongst the community as much as possible. Right now, especially during the lockdown, is Twitter. I was on there
Yeah.
so much. But being on Slack groups, being in Discord groups, being in physical meetups now, and going to conventions, having conversations where I'm making sure that I allow people to be themselves, to express their own needs, instead of an idealized version of how people try to present themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll give you a false sense of what people are dealing with and what they're going through. So allowing the space for people to be themselves is the thing that helps me be empathetic and come from a place where I can meet them where they are. So generally speaking, I try to have like a calming personality, a welcoming tone, and just like not a judging attitude.
Right.
And
Yeah.
those things help keep me grounded and allow people to feel open to be able to have honest and open conversations, so that when I understand what they're dealing with, I can talk to them with a way of knowing what considerations are important to them and truly where they are mentally. And because once again, developers are people. And so
Mm-hmm.
coming from that perspective, that I really try to stay people first.
Yeah. That's pretty much how I do it too. Awesome, Wesley. It's been great talking to you. There's no further questions from the audience or anything, um, as small as they might be. But thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Again, folks, check out his Twitter thread. I dropped it in chat. It's there if you want to copy it somehow, mentally, physically, whatever. Um, the the conversation we had is very good. I would like to have more conversations like this with other people. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me and we'll just come on my channels and we'll talk about whatever we want. And that's pretty much what Wesley and I did today.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Wesley. Really appreciate you coming on and talking about this. I think it's important to highlight, you know, your work and as well as, you know, helping people out with the work they need to do. So again,
Thank you,
thank
Chris,
you.
for giving me the space to talk about this subject. And
No
if
problem.
someone wants to talk to me out of the
Yeah.
public eye, if they have more questions after this, my DMs are open on Twitter. So Wesley83 on Twitter.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. And I'm at Chris Short. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you. And we'll see you soon.